The night janitor at Hitsville, USA had a routine. Third floor down to the main recording room, every night around midnight. He had been doing this for 2 years, and in that time he had learned one thing. Musicians left alone after hours become a different kind of animal entirely. On a Tuesday night in late autumn of 1961, he was mopping the hallway outside Studio A when he heard it. He stopped. He tilted his head the way you do when a sound reaches you before your brain has sorted out what it is. The piano, and something else beneath it, woven through it, something that didn't belong to any instrument he could name. He stood in that hallway for a full minute, mop in hand, just listening. Then he went back to mopping. Some things you simply don't disturb. Inside Studio A, Marvin Gaye was sitting at the upright piano in the corner, the one the session musicians used to warm up before recordings. He had been a session drummer at Motown for almost a year by then. That was his official capacity. The guy who kept the beat, came in when they needed someone reliable behind the kit, did his job and went home. Nobody had asked him if he could sing. Nobody had thought to. He had been in that studio since 7 in the morning. They were cutting backgrounds for a Mary Wells track, and the session had run long the way they always did at Hitsville. Retakes, redirections, Harvey Fuqua leaning over the producer's shoulder suggesting changes in that quiet way of his that still managed to sound like an order. By the time they wrapped, most people cleared out fast. The ones with families went home. The ones without went to the bar on Woodward Avenue. Marvin had stayed. He couldn't have told you exactly why. He was tired. His back hurt from the kit. The sensible thing was to go home and sleep. Instead, he sat in the empty room for 20 minutes doing nothing. And then, without really deciding to, he moved to the piano bench and put his hands on the keys. He was not performing. No audience, no calculation. The room was empty. The recording equipment was off. The overhead lights were down to the 2 safety bulbs. Marvin was just playing. The way you talk to yourself when you're certain nobody's listening. The way you are when the version of yourself that exists for other people can finally put itself away. He started with a chord progression he had been turning over in his head for weeks. Something slow and open, the kind that doesn't resolve quickly, that sits in its tension and makes you wait. His right hand found a melody over it, tentative at first, then more certain. And then, almost without meaning to, he opened his mouth. The voice that came out was not the voice Marvin Gaye used for conversation. It wasn't even the voice people occasionally heard when he hummed along with a track during breaks. This was something entirely different, lower and higher at the same time somehow. Raw in a way that felt less like roughness and more like the complete absence of any protective layer. A voice with nothing between itself and the air in the room. He sang about nothing specific, or he sang about everything at once, which amounts to the same thing. He was 22 years old and had come to Detroit from Washington, D.C. with ambition and very little else. And most days the ambition felt like the only thing holding the rest of him together. He sang about that. Not in words you could write down and analyze, but in the way music carries the things language simply cannot hold. In a building on West Grand Boulevard on a Tuesday night in November, a young man sat alone and finally let his voice go exactly where it had been wanting to go. Smokey Robinson had forgotten his notebook. He was almost to his car when he realized it, that green composition notebook he carried everywhere. He turned around, went back through the side entrance, and was halfway up the stairs when he heard it. He stopped on the 7th stair. He counted them later, for no reason except that his mind fixed on that detail and wouldn't release it. The sound was coming from Studio A, which should have been empty. Smokey stood there with one hand on the railing and listened. The voice went somewhere that made his chest do something he wasn't prepared for. He had written enough songs to understand what separated music that worked from music that did something else entirely. Something that got inside you and didn't come loose. Standing in the dark, he understood he was hearing the second kind. He walked the rest of the way up and pushed open the door to Studio A. Marvin stopped immediately. His hands came off the keys and he turned on the bench. And the expression on his face was the expression of someone caught at something private, which he had been. "Don't," Smokey said. Marvin looked at him. "Don't stop." Smokey came into the room and leaned against the wall just inside the door. He crossed his arms, not in challenge, but the way you hold yourself when you're trying very hard to stay still. Keep going. I was just messing around, Marvin said. No, you weren't. The two men looked at each other across the empty room. Marvin on the bench, caught between standing up and staying put. Smokey against the wall with an expression that was difficult to read, but impossible to misunderstand. He meant exactly what he said. Keep going. Marvin turned back to the piano. He sat for a moment, hands in his lap. Then he put them on the keys and started again. The voice came back, slightly more careful than before, but then it opened up because that's what that voice did when the music gave it room to. Smokey listened without moving. He stayed against the wall for the entire thing, which went on for several minutes. When it ended, the room held its quiet the way rooms do after music. Different from ordinary silence, heavier than it. How long have you been able to do that? Smokey asked. Marvin shrugged. I don't know. Always, I guess. And you've been back there behind the drums this whole time. Harvey needed a drummer. Harvey needs a lot of things, Smokey said. He pushed himself off the wall and walked a few steps into the room, looking at Marvin the way you look at someone you are now quietly reconsidering from the start. What does Marvin Gaye need? Nobody had asked him that. Not with that weight behind it, the weight of someone who had heard something and hadn't decided what to do yet, but already knew they couldn't do nothing. Marvin didn't answer right away. He played a few quiet chords, almost unconsciously, the way some people doodle while thinking. I want to sing, he said finally. It came out more plainly than he intended. No setup, no build-up. Just the fact of it, sitting in an empty room at midnight. I know, Smokey said. I heard. He picked up his notebook from the table where he'd left it, tucked it under his arm, and walked back toward the door. He stopped there and looked back at Marvin, who hadn't moved from the bench. Don't go anywhere tomorrow morning, Smokey said. I wasn't planning to. Good. Neither was I. He left. Marvin sat at the piano a while longer, then went home and didn't sleep particularly well, which was not unusual for him. Berry Gordy did not like being interrupted before 10 in the morning. Everyone at Hitsville knew this. His assistant knew it. The cleaning staff knew it. The delivery drivers knew to leave coffee outside his door, knock once, lightly, and walk away. Smokey Robinson knocked twice and opened the door without waiting at all. Gordy looked up from his desk. He was holding a royalty statement, and his reading glasses were pushed to the end of his nose. He had the expression of a man whose morning had been organized and was now being reorganized without his consent. There's something you need to hear, Smokey said. I need to hear the Miracles session tape from Thursday, Gordy said. I need to hear why the mixing board in Studio B keeps cutting out on the high end. I need to, Barry. Gordy stopped. Smokey only used the first name when something was serious. Gordy took his glasses off. Last night, Smokey said, I heard something in Studio A that I have not been able to stop thinking about. And I have been thinking about music my entire life. So that is not a small thing to say. He paused. You need to come downstairs. Gordy set his glasses down. He looked at Smokey for a long moment, reading his face the way you read someone you've known long enough to trust. Then he stood up. Marvin was in Studio A when they arrived. He had come in at 8, same as always, half expecting another day behind the kit. Instead, he had found a note on the drum stool in Smokey's handwriting. Piano. Wait, so he had waited. When Gordy walked through the door, Marvin stood up from the bench. His eyes moved to Smokey, who gave him a look that said plainly, do what you did last night. Play something, Gordy said. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. He was a man who processed everything through the question of whether it was commercially viable, and right now he was gathering information. Marvin sat back down. He put his hands on the keys. He was keenly aware that Berry Gordy was standing 10 feet away evaluating him, the opposite of being alone in the dark at midnight. He played a few bars, and they came out stiff, careful, the way everything feels when you know it's being measured. Then something shifted. He stopped thinking about Gordy. He found the chord progression, the slow, open one that refused to resolve quickly. And he let the voice do what the voice did when no one was asking it to be anything particular. The notes near the top of his range that no one at Motown had ever heard him reach for. The way the melody moved through its middle section, like it was genuinely looking for something and genuinely finding it. The room did what rooms do when something real is happening in them. It got very quiet. Gordy stood completely still. He had heard thousands of singers, developed the ability to assess a voice quickly, to know within a few bars whether someone had what the radio required, what a crowd responded to. He was not a sentimental man. He was a businessman with exceptional ears. But what Marvin's voice did to the air in that room didn't fit neatly into the framework Gordy had spent years building. When the song ended, the silence held for a beat that was just slightly too long. Gordy turned to Smokey. Smokey looked back with an expression that said, I know. I know exactly. Gordy turned back to Marvin, who was sitting on the bench with his hands in his lap, waiting. The same way he had spent most of his life, really, waiting for something to turn around and see him. What else can you do? Gordy asked. It wasn't the most poetic thing anyone could have said in that moment, but from Barry Gordy in that room, after that silence, it was everything. It meant he was staying. It meant the calculation was already running. It meant the young man who had spent a year keeping everyone else's rhythm from behind a kit was about to be asked, for the first time, to step out front and make some of his own. Marvin looked at him steadily. A lot, he said. That was the morning. The rest is the music, the records and the years and the voice that found its way into millions of rooms and stayed there, long after everything else changed. All of it traces back to a Tuesday night when a 22-year-old sat alone at a piano in the dark and let himself be heard by accident. Some things begin in the quiet, without witnesses, without any plan beyond the simple need to say something true. And then a door opens, and a man on the seventh stair stops and listens, and everything, without any announcement at all, changes. Have you ever had a moment when someone finally heard what you'd been carrying all along? Tell us in the comments.